We are dreamers, shapers, singers, and makers. We study the mysteries of laser and circuit, crystal and scanner, holographic demons and invocations of equations. These are the tools we employ, and we know many things. Hello there, welcome back to the channel. This is Nerdle Empire, where we explore many different science fiction universes and factions, mostly Star Trek. Not today though. Today we are visiting the B5 universe, and one of the most intriguing factions, not a race, but factions, and I'm sure you know who it is because you clicked on the thumbnail and you saw the title. And if you didn't know who they were and you're just curious, welcome. We're going to be discussing the Technomages. Now this is going to be a brief overview. This video was actually requested a while back and it kind of popped into my head to do it, and I will admit, forgotten, and I now can't find the comment because it was at least a month ago and I just can't seem to find it, even though I'm pretty sure I screenshotted it. It's gone. But never mind, this video, as requested, on the Technomages, a brief overview at least. What do we know about the Technomage? Now, some of this information is from the show, some of it is from Expanded Universe, which I'm always dubious about using. I prefer to use hard canon, hard alpha canon, stuff I've seen on screen. However, I do know that some of the beta canon sources, the expanded media from B5 is considered canonical, so we'll delve into it a little bit. Some of this, though, was alluded to in the shows as well, so let's go with that. The Technomages were a faction, not a race. They use very advanced science to simulate the effects of magic. Basically, a plane would look like magic to a Paleolithic hunter-gatherer. So, the more advanced the technology, the more likely it is to seem like magic, basically. It's a common phrase we hear in many different science fiction universes, because there is a certain point where technology would become so advanced that it is indistinguishable from magic. And that's the grey area upon which the Technomages exist. Now, it was alluded to in the show, and, as well as in expanded media, they were actually originally created by the Shadows, a race whose technology was so far beyond that of the younger races, such as humanity, that in many ways Shadow Tech appeared, well, maybe magical might not be the right word, it sounds too whimsical, maybe demonic might be the better word for Shadow Tech. However, nonetheless, it did seem so far beyond our understanding that we simply couldn't comprehend how it operated. They utilized just a fraction of that technology to create the illusion, to simulate the effects of magic, but the Technomages actually wielded some formidable power. They had a lot of mysticism built in with it. The original Technomages, as I said, were created at an unknown time period in history, and they were created by the Shadows to be used as agents of chaos from a long-lost civilization. That race, since going extinct after rebelling against the Shadows, this race were called the Tara Timud, and I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly, but they have since gone extinct. But the survivors amongst them, who were Technomages, spread the philosophy to other worlds and eventually founded the Technomage Order, which, again, they appeared like wizards to many different civilizations. For the most part, they seem to operate a sort of non-interference policy, going about their own business and their own interests, but they recruit new members occasionally from many different species, as well as possibly some being born. That was again one of the more ambiguous elements. Were any Technomages actually born? It seemed that they did. Now, they did mention that they formed attachments and relationships. Galen particularly notes this, but they're not love or attachments as Captain Gideon would understand them, as humans would understand them. I can only assume that it is plausible that these attachments would become romantic and occasionally lead to the birth of children. However, with the Technomages being from many different species, whether or not they are biologically compatible is debatable, and you'd have to form an attachment with your own species, which in some cases it's not entirely clear if Galen was human, for example. He seemed to be, but he wasn't necessarily so. There were a few humans amongst the Technomages, but as Ambassador Londo Malari pointed out, he didn't know that any humans were now amongst their number. Now, of course, the Centauri had been around a lot longer than humans, and they were used to encountering Technomages, although again it's unclear if any Centauri had become Technomages, although it's possible Galen was a Centauri. They do look very human if you shaved his head. But we simply aren't clear. But we do know that up until this point there was no known contact, at least from Ambassador Malari's point of view, that any humans had become Technomages. But he did encounter one at this point. And in certain cultures, particularly Centauri, having a Technomage kind of endorse you was seen as a big win. It was a political statement. They held certain amounts of power simply because they were perceived as not only very powerful and very mysterious, and for them to grant you a favour or even an audience was something of a win, a bit of a coup for you. But, as I said, they seem to operate their own agenda, and although they are not on the side of the shadows, they are certainly opposed to them. They are not agents of chaos. Certain elements of that mentality certainly stays within them. They are not there to be on the side of angels or the side of demons, merely on their own side, with some of them choosing one or the other. Now, we do know that at least one Technomage broke their oaths of basically non-interference and don't do any harm, which was basically their basic guide. They weren't there to hurt you, they weren't there to do harm, but they will defend themselves. He, for monetary reasons, actually took personal gain and created a technovirus which wiped out an entire civilization. This delved into the Technomage's idea of good planets, bad planets, and places of power, which we will get to. And this planet was then heralded as a bad planet, a place where Technomages were forbidden from going, and they were all told about it. And there were many worlds and places in the galaxy like this that Technomages were to avoid. But as Galen would learn, the only reason for this was to cover up their dirty secret that one of their order was responsible for killing the entire planet, which calls into question whether or not some of the other locations may have been for similar things, or whether they genuinely were just to protect you from harm and running into something you really didn't want to run into. If something lived on the planet, or some great power like Zahadum with the shadows being there, you don't want to go disturb them. Things like that. Good planets, bad planets. And the Technomages then would create what we would know as a place of power, where they would live and choose, and it would be a place that they would develop a sort of resonance with, a harmony with, and they would derive somewhat possibly symbolic spiritual power rather than maybe natural manifesting power, but it could be a combination of the two, as we don't fully understand or grasp exactly how the technology of the Technomages works. On that, let's get onto it. That covers the basics of the Technomage. You see, we don't know much about them. Galen was very secretive. We do know that amongst their order you would be an apprentice to another, they would train you, you would eventually get your own ship and your staff, and you would go about your life then as the Technomage and maybe take apprentices yourself and train more. And they are sort of run by the Circle, who are sort of, for lack of a better term, a group of elders. And that's about it. Beyond that, we know almost nothing about how they operate. We do know that when the Shadow War began, instead of staying to help and fight, which some of them, like Galen, wanted to do, knowing what the Shadows were, as I said, they were created by the Shadows. They decided, well, bugger this, we're out of here, and they went off to hide in one of their secret places away from the Shadows. Likely, if the Shadows wanted to, they could have found them, but as a faction like they were, the Shadows probably weren't overly interested in them, so they were pretty low down on the spectrum of things to be interested in. So it's likely the Shadows simply weren't looking for them, rather than they couldn't find them, at least in my opinion. Let me know if you share that, if you think they were advanced enough to genuinely hide from the Shadows. But on their technology, they utilize small vessels, which are generally a delta wing-like design, sort of an old flying wing, similar to 20th century, 21st century Earth aerial craft. Basically, as I said, a flying wing with a sort of triangle on top of it as well. There's no distinguishing features, no necessarily obvious engines to the thing. It is extremely fast, able to keep pace despite its small size, with much larger, faster, generally bigger ships. Because again, space. Got a bigger engine, you generally go a little faster. So ships like the Excalibur, it could easily keep pace with them despite its advanced technology and huge size and engines. This small vessel is easily able to keep pace with it. The same with other Earth Force vessels like the Omega class. There seemed to be no issue with the Technomage vessels keeping pace with them. It's not known if they are armed, but they are likely capable of defending themselves. In what way? It's not clear, as with much of their technology. One way that their vessels do seem to excel is in stealth. They can literally sit off the bow of a ship and it doesn't know they're there. They do occasionally use other races' forms of transport. They will use commercial transports when needed, but many of them do seem to have their own vessels. So why exactly a few of them choose to do that, that's again probably down to them. Maybe their ship was broke. But whatever the reasoning, that's what they have. They also utilize a lot of cybernetic technology. Them and their because they don't see a distinction between the two, they are very integrated with their technology, with their bodies being massively cybernetically enhanced, which allows them to directly interface with their ships, which seem to have some form of AI. And this gives them extra sensory capabilities. They can interface with many different technologies, not just their own, including things like the ability to remote control a homunculus, a sort of hologram with more substance they could create and puppet and move about like it was them, but it's not really them. They also have, again, a direct link with their ship, so it can be both verbally controlled as well as controlled just with a thought. They have many other technologies which again give the illusion of magic, the ability to sort of vanish things. They also utilize a lot of general sleight of hand and general old style trickery as well, and they tend to embrace the theatricality. The reason for this is simplistic. It's old con, basically. They want to portray themselves as magical and something greater. Simply popping up and doing their thing probably isn't enough. There has to be a little whimsy, a little bit of theatricality to go along with it for the awe factor as well, because perception of them being this way is just as powerful as their actual abilities, which, although impressive, are clearly not so impressive that they are able to stand toe-to-toe with the bigger, more powerful races. However, they do, if one of them is on your side, as we saw with Galen and assisting the Excalibur, they can not only give you good fortune, they can be great sources of insight because they are very knowledgeable and extremely well studied, as they actually consider knowledge and the pursuit of knowledge and information to be extremely valuable traits. So generally, Technomages are highly intelligent, well educated, and well traveled. So they know a lot, and they can be very useful in those situations. They are not immortal, however. They can die, they can be killed, and there's some indication that perhaps their technology extends their lives, but it does not make them immortal or invulnerable, simply very strong. And that, interestingly, is more or less kind of it. As I said, the Technomage are deliberately mysterious. They are deliberately ambiguous about their abilities and about who they are and what they can do, and about their numbers, how many of them there are, how many ships they've got, their true capabilities. They keep this tightly guarded. What their ultimate agendas seem to be is unknown. They are perceived by different races in different ways. Humans, for example, view Technomages as little more than theatrical con artists and showmen. They actually view them as a resource. For example, they wanted Galen to assist with the integration of shadow technology into human technology. But of course he was never going to do that. He was never going to help them with that. The Vorlons simply didn't trust them, considering them to be a group of liars, as the Vorlon name for them translated as liar or storyteller, which is not surprising considering the Vorlons are sworn enemies of the shadows, and the Technomage were a shadow creation. One that rebelled, certainly, but that doesn't make them something that falls in line with Vorlon philosophy. They were still another. They were still something else, and the Vorlons simply wanted nothing to do with it. The Centauri, as I said, saw them as a prestige element, and generally, as far as we can tell, many races kind of saw them that way, were either wary of them or saw them in awe. Some humans that had contact with them literally did see them as magicians and a source of great power and protectors. It varied depending on the group, the culture, the world, and the individual Technomage. Again, not all Technomages were good. Some were evil, like one that helped in an absolute genocide. Others were good, like Galen, who helped prevent genocides and find a cure to the Drak plague. Things like that. Saved Captain Gideon floating around in space when he could have simply carried on past him with the rest of the Technomages and left him there to die, but he simply couldn't do that. As he put it, he couldn't. When you find a stray cat, you got to look after it. That's the sort of analogy he made. So we don't overly know much more about them, but in short, they're very advanced. Their technology borders on magical because it's so advanced. They're at least able to stand somewhat shoulder to shoulder with the bigger, older races like the Vorlons and the Shadows, or definitely with the Minbari and other groups like that. They draw on their members from many different civilizations, and in general, their entire way of life is predicated on upkeeping this illusion and this mystique so that they can actually go about whatever their true agenda actually is, which is something that hasn't been fully explored. But they do seem, at least for the most part, at least in philosophical basis and in their general beliefs, to be on the side of a sort of chaotic good. But let me know your thoughts about the Technomage in the comment section down below. Of course, I've skipped over a lot of the story beats involving them from the show, but to be honest, there isn't a great deal we learn about them. If Crusade had not been unceremoniously cancelled, we would have gone on to learn a great deal more about them, which is tragic that we didn't. And with that said, if you have made it all to the end of this video, I do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Comment your thoughts down below, and see you next time. Bye-bye.